Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, October 1st, 2024. Happy October. In about 34 days, we will be in for the 2024 presidential election, a matchup that has been long anticipated since the 2020 presidential election. In this race, we have Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz running as the Democratic ticket for President of the United States, the Republican ticket, former President Donald Trump, and Senator J.D. Vance. Now, this election has been far more competitive than I think both sides of the aisle would like to see it become. And that's because this race truly is potentially the closest race we will see of this 21st century. And a big reason for that is because Kamala Harris was not the Democratic nominee roughly 3 months ago. When you're talking back all the way back in July, Joe Biden was the Democratic nominee for president and Kamala Harris was his running mate. Now, in a switch at the top of the ticket, the 2024 race narrowed quite tremendously and Kamala Harris took the upper hand in a number of my own predictions. But in this video, what we're going to find is that some of the states have since changed since my last prediction mid-September, 50 days out from the election, that will likely go to show that in this final month, we'll do week updates through October through November, showing the change in election week after week after week, because it's going to get increasingly more narrow, and today is the VP debate, and we should expect a lot of discourse and conversation around who might win this election. Now, the 2024 race, too, beyond that point, is one that I have found to be quite fascinating to watch just at baseline. I think I've come into this with a very different understanding of what the race might have looked like back in January and February, and it's very different from the 2020 election where from nearly the beginning, I almost knew that Joe Biden would always be that Democratic nominee for president. And because of that, it has resulted in different things changing in some of these battleground states, unique appeals that Vice President Kamala Harris has that President Joe Biden did not in terms of overall electoral strategy. And so on the grand scheme of things, Kamala Harris has changed this way in a fundamentally positive way for the Democratic Party, as well as the fact that Donald Trump, while doing better than he has ever in polling data, is still not on track for a substantive victory compared to 2016, which means if Harris or Trump won, I would expect both of them to underperform the numbers of 2016 and 2020 because they were identical, just flipped, under 306 electoral votes. And so I think that sort of grounds us as to where we are right now in this election cycle, where we are when it comes down to the Kamala Harris-Donald Trump matchup. And we're going to go ahead and continue through this. With 181 electoral votes already in the Democratic column, of course, Republicans have their own safe states. The states I am characterizing are states that are decided by likely 15 points or more that will be decisive in giving Donald Trump or Kamala Harris a victory as the states that are just fundamentally so in favor of the Republican and Democratic tickets. And so this includes states like Indiana, states like Missouri, states like Wyoming that are going to be phenomenally strong for the Republicans at large. And we're going to see it in a number of these states. Let's see if we can continue down. Alabama goes there. Kansas would go there too. South Carolina, not necessarily, but the rest of it here overall, Donald Trump at 113 electoral votes, Kamala Harris at 181. And in these remaining 244 toss-up electoral votes, again, we have a considerable portion of states that we like to characterize as likely. So what does that mean? What does a likely state actually tell us? Well, one, we know that the Democratic or Republican nominees are likely to win the state, meaning that if I was to bet on it today, I would feel quite comfortable in making that characterization, and it probably hasn't changed over the past 4, 5, 6 months. But it doesn't mean it's entirely out of reach for the GOP either. If we're saying Kamala Harris has a likely victory in Iowa, for instance, which is not going to happen, but saying that as the example, it isn't out of the world of possibility that Donald Trump could win Iowa. On the flip side, if we were to say that, Donald Trump won Arkansas, is going to win Arkansas as a safe state, there is zero chance that Kamala Harris wins the state. And if she did, it would be an even bigger electoral upset than anything we have seen in the past half century. And so as we ground ourselves in knowing that, these likely states are more than likely going to go to the respective party nominees by a margin of anywhere between 5 and 15%. I love to predict down to the margin because I think it's a bit more accurate in actually gauging what you can expect. It's a lot easier to say there's a chance at victory. I think what we're looking at here is what the margin will be in conjunction with said victory. And so as we go through it, you can find states like Colorado and New Mexico become likely Democratic states. Republicans on their end have their own set of likely states as well. Ohio, I would consider to be a likely state. I think Iowa started to revert back to being more favored towards Donald Trump. Mississippi moved out of likely. Kansas moved out of likely. Montana has moved out of likely. South Carolina would be likely red. Alaska would be likely red. And so that brings us roughly here to about 148 electoral votes. I'd also say Maine's 2nd congressional district would be a likely red state. But beyond that, too, we're pretty much done with the likely Republican states. Democrats aren't done just yet. Their home state for their vice presidential nominee, who again is debating this evening against Senator J.D. Vance from the state of Minnesota. New Hampshire is going to be pretty strong for Democrats. Maine's going to be pretty strong for Democrats. Virginia is going to be pretty strong for Democrats. And we're picking the pieces of puzzles up here to form this magic number of 270 potentially for either side. Democrats already at a pretty strong showing at 225. I also think Nebraska's 2nd, which has been a large indicator of suburban trend line across the United States. The suburbs there, Nebraska's 2nd, the strong base out of Omaha. Democrats are going to win there. They're going to win Virginia, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Colorado, New Mexico, bringing them to at least 226 electoral votes. But Donald Trump still has some pretty big victories to come out of states like Florida and Texas, who can actually kick us off by characterizing the first states that we deem to be lean red or lean blue states. And a big reason why I'm trying to fill out the majority, overwhelming majority, arguably, of the electoral map now is because I want to spend a lot of time focusing on these remaining 7 states. But to give some attention to Texas and give some attention to Florida, Florida has actually narrowed a bit since we last saw it in 2020. Just in terms of 2022, rather, Democrats were obliterated in 2022 in Florida, not doing well whatsoever. Democrats are on track to actually do a lot better than many people would have expected a year ago in the state of Florida, but they're not going to come close to winning. They're probably going to lose anywhere from 4 to 5 points, an expansion of 2020, but still keeping it within that lean characterization, which means Democrats are still in a pretty okay place, at least nationwide. When it comes down to Texas, that's a better example of a state that has trended a little bit more to the left than Republicans would have hoped for. In 2012, Romney won it by a margin of 16 points. In 2016, Trump won it by 9. In 2020, Trump won it by 5.6. This time, I think he wins it by less than 5, but regardless, it's a victory. 40 electoral votes goes to Donald Trump. He makes up that margin tremendously, now at 219. And so the delta between the two candidates is roughly 7 electoral votes, which means it does actually come down to the narrowest and narrowest of margins: Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Now, in my last prediction, I had Democrats winning in the state of Georgia. Sorry, not winning in the state of Georgia. Republicans winning in the state of Georgia. But that was by a tilt Republican characterization. Given what we've seen out of the state so far and what we've seen in recent data points, is I do think that Georgia is going to be now a lean Republican state. I think we've seen minor improvements for Donald Trump on the national scale. You can see that when we were 50 days out from the election, the win probability for Kamala Harris was roughly 64% nationwide. Today, it is reduced down to 56%, and I see that in some of these battleground states, Georgia being a really good example. And I think it is a state, too, that Democrats know is always and has always been quite competitive for them in the past 4 to 6 years. It's a state that has shown competitive governor races, Senate races, House races, multiple down-ballot statewide races, and, of course, the presidential level, where Georgia is just exceptionally close. Recently, though, the numbers out of the state have been quite promising for Donald Trump's campaign. We've seen a slight uptick in terms of possibilities of victory in the state, and I think a big reason for that is because some of the data points we've been seeing out of Georgia have slightly improved for Donald Trump. Kamala Harris, who was up on that time on September 18th, the last time roughly I made the prediction 50 days out, today Donald Trump has flipped it nearly entirely. And so 56% national in Georgia, that translates to a loss. I agree. I think Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have the slight upper hand when it comes down to the state of Georgia. When we move over, though, to some other states, another state that I think is good for Kamala Harris is the state of Michigan, where I think Kamala Harris will likely see one of her larger margins out of the 3 Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, if not the largest margin. Biden did very poorly in the Rust Belt compared to Kamala Harris. His numbers were down. The expectation and enthusiasm there was down. There wasn't this resurgence of support the Democrats experienced when she reached to the top of the ticket. And Michigan is a perfect example of how, voters who do not appreciate or like the actions of the Biden-Harris administration can really turn their backs on the president of the United States. We saw it specifically amongst Arab American voters who, in Dearborn, Michigan, make up a significant chunk of the Democratic Party's voting base. That we saw the birth of the uncommitted movement, the birth of the abandoned Biden movement, who has now transitioned into abandoned Harris, and we had seen some significant pull away from President Biden at the top of the ticket. At the same time, what we've also started to see is a resurgence in support amongst minority communities in Michigan, an increase in enthusiasm, an increase in voter turnout, which is what we will likely see translate to Kamala Harris winning the state of Michigan, who actually was, in 2016, despite voting for Trump, the least pro-Donald Trump state out of all of them nationwide. Not to mention the fact that it was a state that voted in favor of Biden the most out of the 3, roughly 3 points statewide. And so Kamala Harris at 241, a big reason for that is the state of Michigan, but it's counteracted. It's counteracted by a call in the state of North Carolina, where we've seen a slight reduction in support for Kamala Harris. Now, in my last prediction, I had it as tilt blue. And that's because we were riding high on this wave of Kamala Harris doing well nationally, doing well in the polls, doing well in the favorabilities. And she still is, right? She's now favored by 1 point nationally when she was down 17 points just 3 months ago. She has rebounded her perception. But when it comes down to winning North Carolina, right now we're just not seeing it to the same extent. North Carolina, Georgia sort of have seen a pretty universal shift across those two states, which isn't massive enough to say, Georgia is now a safe red state or North Carolina is now a lean red state, but it does shift the states when North Carolina in the last prediction was tilt blue and Georgia was tilt red. They shift over just a little bit, which makes a bit of a difference when it comes down to the overall margin, but especially makes a difference in North Carolina when it flips from blue to red. And so that brings Donald Trump to the upper hand against Kamala Harris at 251 electoral votes. But let's continue. Let's continue talking about some of these other battleground states. Pennsylvania is a state where right now, I think Kamala Harris has the narrowest, and I mean narrowest, the narrowest of margins in this state. I think of all the states she has to win, Pennsylvania right now genuinely might just be the closest. And I think a big reason for that is because the Donald Trump team isn't making any mistakes from 2016 and 2020. Now, don't get me wrong. They invested in those states back in 2016 and 2020. But the extent at which they are investing in this cycle, you can see it immensely coming down to Pennsylvania in particular. Over $100 million has been slated to be spent or has been spent by the Donald Trump campaign nationally, geared on the state of Pennsylvania in particular, right? The national focus is down to Pennsylvania and a few other battleground states, and it doesn't really extend to all the same states the Democrats are not only wanting to fund, but rather what's more important, being able to fund, given the significant amount of funds they have raised since Kamala Harris has reached the top of the ticket, the significant amount of enthusiasm and energy from their donor base. Pennsylvania is one of those states where Democrats are investing in heavily, but so is Donald Trump. And historically, what we know is that Democrats almost always have to out-fundraise Republicans quite tremendously to win an election. Republicans just baseline have significant support. And based on recent elections where we've seen high enthusiasm and high turnout, you can find that sometimes Republicans do, in fact, have that baseline where even if they spend $0, they're still in a competitive race. Democrats don't have that luxury in some of these battlegrounds. And so in the remaining 27 toss-up electoral votes, it really is anybody's game at this point. These states are going to be decided by some pretty narrow amounts. Wisconsin in particular is a state where I think, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump again are neck and neck at. And you can see that in some of the analytics. You can see that in Wisconsin, this is a state that Kamala Harris currently has the narrow upper hand according to FiveThirtyEight. Arizona is another state too, where Donald Trump has the narrow upper hand. And it is all around a really, really competitive race. Arizona right now, I'd say Donald Trump maintains a very narrow advantage. My last prediction I had it as lean blue, so this is quite of a swing here. But I do think Democrats have lost some ground in there. I also think, too, when it comes down to the issues that are pressing to voters on the southern border the most, Democrats don't have the best ratings when it comes down to that based on opinion polling data. You can see that in some of these battlegrounds, Kamala Harris's approval rating on the border is in the negatives, whereas in some other states, such as New Hampshire, it could sometimes be in the positive depending on the poll you're looking at. And sure, Arizona is a far more competitive state than New Hampshire, but at the end of the day, it's still a swing state. And Arizona is a perfect example of how messaging when it comes down to immigration and the border might be something that Democrats need to improve upon if they are to win this battleground state. Because it's 11 electoral votes right now, I would argue go to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. And so 16 remaining toss-up electoral votes split between Wisconsin and Nevada. These are two states that really, really have a chance of fluctuating in this cycle. What my gut tells me, and what I think we have seen because of the lack of significant data out of Nevada, is that Kamala Harris has the narrow upper hand because of a combination of factors. Electoral history, 2022 election performance, lack of strong down-ballot Republican candidates, and the fact remains, Nevada has not voted for a Republican in the 21st century except once in 2004, and that was barely when John Kerry was losing in a number of other states. Nevada right now, I think Kamala Harris does ultimately take the cake and wins this state by a tilt margin, not a lean margin, like I said previously, a tilt margin, but a win is a win when it comes down to the electoral map. And so when it comes down to Wisconsin, the final state here, 266 to 262, this 10 electoral votes will, in fact, make all the difference. Shockingly enough, what I think the Ann Seltzer poll in Iowa revealed to us, and the Nebraska second polls are telling us, and what we've seen in Michigan too, and Ohio, is that the Midwestern strength that Kamala Harris exhibits does seem to have a unique appeal in the state of Wisconsin, even more than it does in some other battleground states. And so I think Wisconsin right now, I genuinely mean this when I say this, goes to Kamala Harris by a lean Democratic margin. It's not massive and it's not a blowout, but it's a victory nonetheless. It renders Pennsylvania the closest state, Michigan the largest, and Wisconsin that middle ground state for the first time in quite some time when it comes down to battlegrounds. But overall, what we're seeing here, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, I do think will vote together as they have for the past 24 years. And with it and Nevada, Kamala Harris reaches 276 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 262. That's my prediction, 1 month and a week out from the presidential election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, this video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.